All right, today we're headed to Edinburgh, Scotland. We're going to explore one of its most legendary spots, a real, actual street that was buried hundreds of years ago and basically frozen in time. Let's get into it. So, picture this. Right under the feet of everyone walking along Edinburgh's famous Royal Mile, there's an entire neighborhood from the 1600s, just sitting there in the dark. It's become a hotspot for ghost stories and plague legends, but what's the real story? What actually happened down there? To get to the truth, you've really got to peel back the layers of myth. We have to dig into the actual historical records, and when you do, you find a story that's honestly way more fascinating than any ghost story. Okay, so first things first, let's be clear about what this place is. Mary King's Close isn't just some spooky cellar or creepy tunnel. No, this was a genuine street, a whole network of tight, narrow alleyways where hundreds of people lived and worked and, yeah, died. And get this, it was like a vertical society. The buildings here were huge, some soaring up to 7 stories high. And where you lived on that vertical axis said everything about you. The rich? They lived on the top floors, way up in the fresh air. But the poorest folks, they were stuck down on the ground floors, in the damp, the dark, and all the filth. Now let's talk about the story that made this place famous, the Great Plague of 1645. You've probably heard the legend, but I'm telling you, the reality is something else entirely. So this is the biggest myth we've got to bust. The horrifying story about plague victims being sealed up behind brick walls and left to die, it's just not true. The records actually show something way more organized, if still pretty grim. The sick were quarantined and cared for, and the healthy people were moved out to camps to keep them safe. The close was never, ever walled up. So why did disease spread so fast? Well, sanitation was not really a thing. There was no plumbing, so when your chamber pot was full, you'd just yell "Gardez-loo," which comes from the French for "watch out for the water," and heave it out the window. All that waste would just flow in open channels right down the middle of the street. Now, at the time, they didn't know about germs. They thought the plague was spread by something called miasma, just bad air. We now know it was fleas from rats. But even without understanding the science, they had a system. If you were sick, you'd hang a white flag out your window. It wasn't surrender. It was a call for help, a signal that you needed food and supply. And right into this nightmare steps a hero, a man named Dr. George Ray. You've seen the outfit, right? That terrifying bird-like mask. He stuffed the beak with herbs, thinking it would purify the bad air. But the real genius of the suit, probably by accident, was that it was made of waxed leather from head to toe. It created a perfect barrier that kept the infected fleas from biting him. His treatment method was absolutely brutal, but it worked. He'd find the telltale boils, the buboes, and he would slice them open, drain the infection, and then he'd cauterize the wound with a searing hot poker. It's horrifying to even think about, but it saved people's lives. And here's the part that really gets you. For all his heroism, for all the lives he saved, the city council never paid him in full. They had promised him a huge sum, but it's believed they just assumed he'd die doing the work. When he survived against all odds, they just didn't pay up. So, with all this talk of plague and doctors, you have to wonder, who was Mary King? Was she some famous victim? A ghost? Nope. The real Mary King was an absolute powerhouse. Mary King was a widow, a merchant, and a property owner here back in the 1630s. She ran her own businesses, she had tenants, she even had a vote on the city council. Now you have to understand, for a woman in the 17th century to be doing all that, it was almost unheard of. She was a big deal. To really get a feel for Mary's world, you gotta understand how old Edinburgh was built. The whole city was basically a network of these things called closes. So a close is just a narrow alley that runs off a main street like the Royal Mile. They were like the veins and arteries of the city, and they almost always got their names from either the most important person who lived there or from the type of work that everyone did there. And Mary's Close wasn't unique in that way. When you look at old city records, you see the Royal Mile was lined with them. You had Todd's close for the fox fur traders, Skinner's close for the leather workers, even a Morocco close, named for a guy who lived there. It shows you this was a living, breathing city where your name and your work mattered. So, the big question, if this was a real street, where'd it go? Well, in the 1750s, the city wanted to build a huge, fancy new building called the Royal Exchange, but it was on a steep hill. So to make a flat foundation, they just chopped the tops off the buildings in Mary King's Close and buried the rest. They used the old street as the foundation for the new one, accidentally creating a perfect time capsule underneath. Okay, we've gone through the history, we've busted the myths, we've met the real people. But I know what you're thinking. What about the ghosts? Let's talk about the most famous one, a little girl named Annie. Now, here's where the story takes a weirdly modern turn. The legend of Annie isn't some centuries-old tale. It started in the 1990s, when a Japanese psychic was touring the close. She said she felt this overwhelming sadness and the spirit of a little girl who told her she died from the plague and was just devastated because she lost her favorite doll. So, right there on the spot, to try and comfort this little spirit, the psychic went out and bought a doll and left it for her in the room. And that one small act of kindness, it started a phenomenon. Ever since that day, people visiting from all over the world have brought gifts for Annie. The space is now called Annie's Room, and it's filled with thousands of dolls, toys, letters, even money from different countries. It's become this incredible living memorial built by total strangers for the ghost of a little girl. And I think that gets to the very heart of Mary King's Close. Whether you believe in ghosts or not is kind of beside the point. The stories of the people who lived here, their struggles, their lives, it's all so powerful that it still echoes today. It feels alive. So, are the chills people feel down there really spirits? Or is it just the weight of history, so strong that it simply refuses to be forgotten? That's something you have to decide for yourself.